welcome to the select scene commentary for the rediscovered deleted scenes from The Big Boss. I'm Brandon Bentley, and while I wanted to do commentaries for these scenes, I figured I'd stick with the mainstream Cantonese cut for the feature-length commentary and then do a select scene commentary for just the deleted and extended scenes. And we're kicking off with the literal harvest that is golden for the logo, well before the famous Big G logo that will be attached to most versions later on. And as we kick into the credits, you'll notice the animation order more closely matches the 70s era versions of the film, such as the National General Pictures US release, rather than the slightly reassembled version in the Cantonese re-release. This means that some of the credit overlays no longer block the actual Big Boss logo, such as the Nora Meow credit, and we still have James Tian credited as Paul Tian, which would end up reappearing in the Cantonese re-release. But before I get too ahead of myself, who thought this day would finally come? Now, is it completely uncut? No, and I do go into detail about that elsewhere. But to be honest, I think what's still missing from the film may be more of an uphill, yet not impossible, battle to overcome in the coming years and decades. But I couldn't be more grateful than I am now that we found any of this footage, and all because the Arrow team just asked for it. Then Fortune Star and the Hong Kong Film Archives pulled through. And for me to be able to professionally ramble about something I've been personally looking for about a quarter of a century, yeah, I'm living the dream. But enough fanboying, let's get into the new footage. So this scene is a prime example of cutting the fat to get to a certain runtime, and something you will see multiple times later in this compilation. Basically, this edit of the scene of Nora Meow's character prepping the ice balls is akin to what you would normally see in an assembly cut of a film, where basically you just edit every scene together in order in their longest possible versions before deciding what needs to be trimmed down when tightening up a film's pacing. Granted, the original longer version fixes the continuity issue of the small towel sitting on top of the ice suddenly disappearing, though I do wish they kept the few seconds of the uncle asking what Chang thought of the dish, just as a nice little character beat.
怎么样？不错。
So, while I've researched a lot of the missing scenes for decades, especially thanks to Jason Hart's extensive online article, this surprised me when I first saw this cut of the film, as I had no idea that Chu Chan's first fight was roughly twice as long. What I find most interesting about this version is that it makes Shu seem like more of an aggressor, as even after he draws blood from one of his opponents and they decide to run off, he won't let them. Like, what was his endgame at this point? In a weird way, it almost foreshadows what happens with Chen Chuan once he allows himself to fight again, that once the fight begins, tunnel vision creeps in, and it's also amusing that this would have given us our first trampoline-assisted jump of the film, which now doesn't occur until the fight with the Gimling Den goons in the finished cut. But much like Chang, he doesn't really stop fighting until he's snapped out of it, but even something as simple as Third Uncle claiming that many aren't Shu's match make it more of a shock when he's killed off later in the film, sort of propping up how dangerous the film's villains can be. And speaking of deleted scenes I wasn't aware of, this also surprised me when I first watched this cut, and this is a decent introduction to the other family members prior to them all abruptly popping out of the house to welcome Shu and Third Uncle, plus establishes Akun as the more comic character, though this might be the most dialogue that Gam-san's Ashan has in the entire film. And the game they're playing is Shang-Chi, which is informally known as Chinese chess or sometimes elephant chess. The game itself represents two armies where, like Western chess, you have to checkmate the enemy's general. And in a weird way, it almost foreshadows the two metaphorical armies of the film, with Chen Chuan and the working class characters going up against the titular Big Boss and his henchmen. Akun's arrogance that he thinks the game is his when Ashan suddenly turns the tables and wins is a nice touch as well, but maybe I'm just reading too into it.
三叔啊，三叔。请到里边坐吧。不客气，帮三叔拿提位。好。三叔，2天没来了，来坐。来，大伙坐。
Now, for those who've either seen the rejected export cut with the original English dub, the French theatrical cut, or the German theatrical cut, some of the extensions here should seem familiar. In fact, I previously isolated these on old releases of the film, but they're now in much better quality here, but I digress. Much like the longer Nora Meow opening scene, this was a matter of the editors looking at this and thinking, what dialogue is absolutely necessary and what gets the point across the fastest? So basically, we lose one line from Chu Chen, and also the last line from the leader of the Gambling Den thugs, but still maintain the basic gist of the scene. To be fair, it's a reminder of the filmmaking process. cutting lines during the script writing process, cutting lines on set, and then cutting lines even further in post-production. And now we come to the first of the more well-known deleted scenes, albeit the ending isn't quite what people have predicted for decades, but we'll get into that shortly. What's significant about the scene is that it's the only scene that was shot in a studio in Hong Kong, and there's actually a shockingly high number of behind-the-scenes photos from the filming, and even one of Bruce Lee's more iconic photos of him shirtless with the jade pendant was shot outside in between takes. Now, this is what I meant when the ending of the scene wasn't accurate to eyewitness reports, as for decades people said that Chang and Hsu were dodging a flaming cart, which honestly never made sense to me, but as we see, it's actually two carts and neither of them are on fire. And this was not shot at Golden Harvest Studios as they weren't ready yet, but actually at the, if I'm pronouncing this right, the Waiter Studio in Hong Kong. It's interesting that so much effort was put into building a set for the scene, considering it doesn't add too much to the characters, though it is interesting to discover that Xu Chen was a self-trained fighter, though Chang never details his own martial arts training. So at this point, we're actually heading into the first of the three scenes that had survived in the 1971 Mandarin theatrical trailer for the film. Though as hardcore fans know, some versions of the trailer had 5 bits of missing footage, one of which we'll detail later. But when I first saw the scene, I thought the opening shot of the shoes being taken off while everyone was asleep was a bit of a parallel to the shot near the end of the film when Chang is trying to sneak out, thinking the cousins are asleep when they were actually already dead. While the previous cart scene honestly feels a bit superfluous and definitely feels like a deleted scene that makes you go, oh, I can see why this was cut. This scene does give a little more personality to Xu Chen, while the finished cut of the film makes Xu out to be this goody two-shoes knight in shining armor. This shows his more, for lack of a better term, playful side, and gives more credence to when Third Uncle says that Xu likes to fight. He's not very boastful in the final cut, but here not only does he relish telling the story, but he also embellishes a bit, while Bruce as Chang does a nice bit of background acting, keeping quiet and letting Xu have his moment, while having a playful, skeptical look on his face. And you'll notice that pretty much the only character living in the house not to be seen in the scene is Xiao Mei, but that'll be discussed elsewhere, as there is photo evidence that she was supposed to appear later on in the scene. Basically, scenes like this ended up on the chopping block due to trying to squeeze in more showtimes per day. The very first cut of the film that had moments lopped out for censorship also had shorter character beats cut just to get to 110 minutes, but of course once the movie blew up and demand was high, the quest to get the film to a max of 100 minutes began, and scenes like this were next to go. Later 70s Hong Kong films like Drunken Master would suffer similar fates, but in cases such as that, export cuts based on the first version managed to escape, thus making it easier to preserve rather than a situation like The Big Boss, when exporting these films weren't quite nearly as high of a priority quite yet. And a little bit was cut right there, but once again we'll discuss that elsewhere.
我是说，朝安站在我旁边，差点挨了一拳。哦。
And one of the shorter deleted moments, and one that pretty much went as I predicted. This was the second of the 3 extra scenes in the trailer, and I always wondered if the scene would just be Chang awkwardly walking past her, and yep, that's exactly what it is. Granted, there's a bit of a jump that I can't tell if it's just print damage or something else was cut, potentially a short inner monologue from Chang, but it did feel like it was just there just to give Nora Miao a bit more screen time.
你们要快点，小姐，看看，哎，哎，有胡子、辫子那个。
Now, this blink and you'll miss it cut was jarring as hell when I first saw it, especially since I thought we'd be seeing the longer cutting of the bodies, yet suddenly we see the manager chucking in a severed head of one of the cousins, yet the dummy head looks more like Bruce. And now the one shot of the film, the running to the factory shot that has randomly popped up in some releases of the movie, but most shockingly in the Columbia Pictures US re-release of the film in 1980. So for the less eagle-eyed viewers, this will just seem like a regular moment, but if you compare the standard export cut scene in the US or UK with the Hong Kong re-release, different versions use different portions of the dialogue in the scene, but this is the most intact version at this point.
回唐山去找老子去了。好了，去开工吧。
So I sound like a broken record, but this was even more footage that I was surprised to see, as I never read or heard anything about it. The only slight giveaway that there may have been more footage was a slightly jarring cut during Tony Liu's portion of the sparring. And I think the reason why we didn't hear about some of these extended moments is that when people are trying to remember a version of a film that they saw over 40 years ago versus what you could easily see on video since the 80s, is that the only extra scenes that are going to stand out are the ones that have drastically different visuals, such as the cart scene, the follow-up at the house,